Hey folks, today I'm going to be talking about Jung's Anima and Animus and the problem of gender and how to make this a truly inclusive conversation. In researching this topic, I basically discovered that it's caused a lot of controversy when it comes to gender and identity, specifically because of our modern understanding of things. Some people have even started to doubt the validity of Jung's theory, and in the last video, I gave an extended definition of the anima and animus to try and bypass this issue and see it from a bigger perspective and make it a truly inclusive conversation. So today I'm going to go a bit deeper into this and share my own perspective on this controversial issue.
This is Deep Psychology. I'm Ross. We blend spirituality, psychology, and self-help to shine a light on your inner workings. Listen if you want to get real, powerful insights and avoid all the fluffy nonsense that abounds in self-help circles. You'll know more about how your psychology works than 99% of people on the planet. Find me on all the major podcasting platforms or head to deep-psychology.com, visited by thousands every month, for tons of free resources. And I'm now on Patreon. I'd really appreciate you supporting the show, and in return you can access exclusive perks. Alright, time for the show.
So, in Jung's day, men were men and women were women. That is, if you were a biological male, you had a masculine personality. And if you weren't male, you didn't have one. If you were a woman, you had a female personality, and if you weren't, then you didn't have that. If you identified as being other than your biological sex, or you exhibited characteristics of the other sex, you could be ridiculed or even punished for that. And the zeitgeist of the time influenced Jung's theory. And you can see this in the theory. It's sort of, from our modern point of view, it seems to be pigeonholing. And it seems that Jung concluded that you could only have an anima, which is in a way, it's your repressed feminine side. You could only have an anima if you were a man, and only if you were a man. And you could have an animus if and only if you were biologically female. Now, to our modern or postmodern sensibility, this seems old-fashioned and naive and insular. But in a way, I have to think we need to recognise that Jung was quite progressive in this regard. It takes a lot of bravery to say that men have a repressed feminine side and that women have a repressed masculine side, especially in his time. And actually, I think in modern day, particularly older generations, they still don't want to admit, that men aren't just men and women aren't just women. There's more of a blend than we think there is. And this has caused quite a problem, become quite a controversial topic when we're talking about Jung's Anima and Animus, because, we start asking things like, well, if gender and sex don't necessarily equate to one another, how can men have a buried feminine side? If gender and sex don't equate to one another, how can women have a buried masculine side? Because it doesn't really make any sense. If all gender is a social construction, then surely Jung's view is as unconvincing as our rigid definitions of gender. Does the concept have any validity at all? Now listen, in this short episode, I'm not going to get caught up in the gender minefield. I'm not going to, one, it's not my area of expertise, and two, I don't really think it's necessary. I think there's a way to make this a genuinely inclusive conversation without getting lost in these endless discussions about, gender and sex. I think it's crucial to realize that the concepts of masculinity and femininity, when you sort of detach them from biological sex, it just tells us that biological men exhibit certain characteristics, which we're going to call masculine ones, and biological women exhibit other characteristics, which are feminine ones. And I'm talking about psychological characteristics here. It doesn't mean that they have to, but it just means that that's what you tend to see in the two different sexes. What's happening nowadays is that we're realizing that actually the masculine and the feminine exhibit themselves in both biological sexes and, in people who don't identify as one or the other. And so how can we take that understanding, the understanding that masculinity and femininity aren't exclusive to a certain biological sex, with the concept of the anima and the animus? And I think there is quite an easy way to do this. To integrate our modern sensibility and attunement to Jung's, original understanding, his pioneering work in this area. And to help us do this, I think it's really important we realize that our new sensitivity to gender and identity contributes something very important. And it's basically that our identity is more fluid than we believe it is. That even in biological sex, there's not so many rigid, strict boundaries as we think they are. And when it comes to psychology, the boundaries really aren't as rigid as we maybe thought they were. And this helps us realize that we're more complex than we believe we are. Though might be primarily masculine, we might be a biological man, we might identify as such, and we might have primarily masculine traits, we also have feminine aspects and vice versa. And I think it helps us see that masculinity and femininity are simply two poles or archetypes, to use a Jungian term, that express themselves through us in varying amounts. The names simply derive from the fact that, you know, historically and, well, the tendency is that one sex exhibits one more than the other. They're not intended as a way to repress or categorize or stereotype people. And how can we use this? Well, my definition in my last episode was basically to say that the anima is the repressed feminine and the animus is the repressed masculine. And it doesn't matter what gender or sex you identify with, this is still the case. All of your masculine traits have their feminine shadow, and all of your feminine traits have their masculine shadow. And listen, there's a lot of nuance here. There's the shadow that we sort of create ourselves, but there's also the shadow, and this I mentioned it in the last episode as well. Just by being a certain way, we automatically have a kind of hole or shadow in our psyche. And this isn't necessarily a negative thing, but it just shows you that the conscious self seems to be in charge, but this is kind of an illusion. So, because anima and animus are the shadow aspects of masculinity and femininity, it means that we all have an anima and an animus under this definition, because we all have masculinity and femininity within us. Therefore, we all have a shadow. We all have shadow from each of those different poles. And this takes it out of, the problem of gender and sex. It doesn't matter what your gender is, it doesn't matter what your sex is for this conversation. What I'm basically saying is that we all have a shadow, we all have masculinity and femininity in shadow. And in terms of Jung's original definition, we all have this ideal image of a man and this ideal image of a woman, regardless of what our gender or sex is. And so, forgetting our biological gender, are we primarily identified with masculinity or femininity? Is this healthy? Do we integrate the other pole? And what do we shun? Do we shun one or the other? Do we shun certain characteristics in our psyche? This is what's important in psychology. What are we consciously identifying with, and what is buried in the subconscious? And because of this expanded way of looking at things, everyone is included, not because our sex or our gender are special or unique in any way, but because our sex and our gender don't really matter in this conversation unless they help us understand our own psychology and our own masculinity, femininity, anima, and animus. And we can ask more generally, well, which psychological qualities help me live fully and express myself, and which hamstring me? And in the pursuit to understand this, we might find that these concepts are pretty useful because certain traits do have a masculine or feminine feel around them. And so, once we start to identify those traits within us, we can ask, do I integrate the opposite pole well? And how might I do that? Now, this conversation can be genuinely inclusive and sort of avoid the minefield of political correctness and sensitivity and not wanting to say certain things for fear of offending people. I'm not saying we should offend people, but here here's a way to just avoid that problem in the first place by taking masculinity and femininity out of the gender and sex conversation and saying, look, we all have them to different degrees, so how well are we embodying them? And I think more importantly, it shows us the complexity and the trickiness of our own psyche. We can't just trust the qualities that we consciously identify with. We can't necessarily trust, I'm a man and I don't want to integrate my femininity, or I'm a woman and I don't want to integrate my masculinity. It's we all have both, and the extent to which we're not integrating them is the extent to which we're not going to be authentic and full. So these are the things to look out for. All right, that's everything I wanted to say on this topic. You can also check out my previous video on the Anima and Animus to get more insight, particularly into Jung's original view and how to reintegrate your repressed traits, your unconscious traits. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you again soon.